The Grab tab, if I can show you that, opens and closes so you can move it out of your way if you're trying to see something on the screen. The audio pane shows you that you have two options for listening to us. One is to use the telephone, the other is to use your microphone and speakers on your computer. In the audio pane you have the audio setup button that will allow you to adjust your volume, do other kinds of things if you need to adjust that at all to check to make sure that you can hear us if you're struggling there. If you're on the telephone, you can see where you dial in and where you enter your audio PIN for us. So that should be fairly obvious right there for you. And finally, if you have questions for me, you can communicate with me through the questions box. During the presentation, if you think of a question, go ahead and just type that in. I can see it as it comes up. And when we go to the question and answer period, I will ask some of the more common questions to the panelists on the line. And finally, if you want to not have the control panel automatically go away, you can click on the view button at the top of the control panel screen and unclick the auto hide the control panel button. Just to quickly tell you, our upcoming webinars will be on October 7th. That's a Wednesday at 3 o'clock. That will be strategies for coaching moot court teams, and we have an exciting panel of folks for that. Mike Allen, who is here at Stetson, Colleen Barger, who is from the University of Arkansas Little Rock, who is also visiting here with us at Stetson, and Mary Beth Beasley at Ohio State will be talking about those moot court coaching strategies, and that invitation will be coming out very soon, so watch your email. On Friday, November the 13th, we'll be doing Innovations in Upper Level Writing Courses. Jason Palmer here at Stetson will be moderating that. And again, our panelists will be Carolyn Browering-Jacobs at Cleveland Marshall, Tamara Herrera at Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State, and Joe Morrissey here at Stetson, each talking about a unique way that they're working on upper level legal writing courses. So I want to go ahead now and give you a quick introduction of our speakers who will be starting here very shortly. Linda Anderson is the Associate Professor of Law here at Stetson, as well as the Associate Director of Research and Writing. She has a background in curriculum design and adult learning theory, and she has been writing on that in the past. And she's currently the co-chair of our curriculum committee looking at outcomes and assessments. Linda will be speaking first, and she'll be talking about designing outcomes in the legal writing course. Sophie Sparrow is also on the line, and she is from Franklin Pierce Law School. Sophie has a book recently out that she has co-authored called Teaching Students by Design, Engaging Students from Syllabus to Final Exam. She's written prolifically on professionalism, pedagogy, rubrics, and active learning, and she was the director of the Legal Research and Writing program at Franklin Pierce for nearly a decade, from 1998 to 2008. And she'll be talking today about assessments in the context of the legal writing course. So now I'm going to turn it over to Linda Anderson. Linda, are you there?
I am here, and I think I just need to get confirmation that my screen can be seen.
I can see that, Linda.
Great. So Kirsten, thank you for having me, and welcome to all of you who are out there listening to us as we try out this new technology, actually, and I'm very excited about doing it this way. I'm also really excited about the fact that we're talking about learning outcomes, student learning outcomes, or student learning objectives. I use the terms interchangeably. And what was extremely exciting to me was just this past weekend I was at the Legal Educations at the Crossroads Assessment Conference in Denver. And there I saw a mix of legal writing faculty and casebook faculty and deans, all at various levels, all talking about assessment, including assessment of learning outcomes. Legal writing faculty, I know, have been talking about outcomes and student learning objectives for a long time, but it really feels like the rest of the legal education community is really beginning to catch on. So that's always been something that's been important to me in designing courses, and I was really pleased to see that other folks are really paying attention to this. So my goal today is to, by the end of this session, have heard about ways to create student learning outcomes and seen some idea about how the design of the outcomes can actually help us in our course planning, so that they're not just useful for accreditation purposes or ABA approval purposes, but that they're useful for actually designing effective courses, and that you've seen the connection between the development of those learning outcomes and opportunities to actually improve our own teaching as well. Though probably not the norm for legal writing professors, since most of us spend a good deal of time actually thinking about pedagogy, many courses in law school and in other settings are designed in this linear fashion. Someone identifies a list of content that's important to the field of study. It's either handed to the professor or they design it themselves. But they start with the content. And then the syllabus gets created by organizing that content into some sort of outline of a topic or a series of topics. And then those topics get fleshed out into lectures, presentations, discussions, assignments, and finally, because we have to know whether our students have actually gotten anything, some sort of test is developed for the end. That's the traditional higher education, especially legal, not necessarily legal, but other than legal writing, that's the traditional way that courses are often designed, or at least they used to be. What's missing is consideration of what students need once they leave your class. And that requires thinking about goals beyond content and beyond coverage. And it's these alternative goals that focus on student learning and problem solving and what the students take away from the course that takes us away from just looking at basic coverage. Now, most of us in the legal writing community probably do this already, or we at least attempt to do it. And after today, I'm hoping that if you do it, you're going to have some idea about how you might do it even more effectively. And if you haven't yet had the opportunity to try to design your own course or to design portions of your own course, that hopefully you'll be able to have some idea about where to start in a way that's going to be most effective for your students. Now, I've been looking at instructional design for a number of years, even before I started teaching at the law school level. And no matter what instructional design expert you read or listen to, all of them basically agree that we need to look at these four things: goals, teaching activities, feedback and assessment methods, and situational factors or contexts and constraints. And what I want to be looking at today is how closely related these are to each other. And it's that interconnectedness that actually helps us design effectively. The best way to actually see that interconnectedness and how important it is to think about what it might look like when the course is not interconnected, when it's not integrated, when these four different pieces are separate and we don't think about how to connect all of them together. What often happens is maybe two of them are connected but not the third, or a different set of two and one is sort of left out there hanging. Because most times we have a course that has some sort of learning goals. The goals might be we understand whatever the content is, some type of content, and that the students are going to think critically in that subject area. So someone's articulated learning goals. And their teaching activity is traditionally a lecture type of situation. What happens is the students might get the content, but because they get no practice or feedback about how to actually learn to think critically, the assessment on that critical thinking goal is going to show that they probably haven't done this very well. And if a professor recognizes that and designs assessment to cover the critical thinking goal, then sometimes that's at the expense of the actual content. So what's important is to think about how to fit all the pieces together. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. We have all these separate pieces. We have to integrate them together to create the whole picture. The very first place to start, though, is before you talk about what you can control, look at what you can't control. Look at the context and the constraints under which you have to design the course, because sometimes these present opportunities and sometimes they present some challenges. Some of these things to consider for context and constraint are the number of students and their characteristics, the frequency and the length of each class, the physical elements of the classroom. Are you in a room where you can move the tables around so that you can design some activities, or are you in an auditorium where people have stadium seating and you can't even walk up the stairs? And what expectations are placed on your course as a result of institutional expectations or the profession, or where does the course fit within the larger curriculum? All of these are things that we don't have a great deal of control of, but it's important to actually take the step to articulate them and keep them in mind as you are designing the rest of the course. So you want to recognize that they present some challenges and they present some opportunities, and sometimes they're a mix of both. But once you've gotten over that, the things you can't control, then the place to start is with the learning goals. And in order to identify student learning outcomes or student learning objectives, or as I'm referring to them, the learning goals, ask yourself what you want students to be able to do as a result of having completed the course, rather than what will they have been exposed to or what will I have covered throughout the course. Once you've determined the challenges and the opportunities presented by the factors out of your direct control and moved to identifying the actual objectives, you're looking at the end result. And what you're actually doing is engaging in what some will refer to as backwards planning or reverse engineering. We ask our students to do this sometimes when we ask them to do a draft and then outline what they've done for the draft to see where their gaps are. But by looking at what the end result is, you can thoughtfully and realistically provide the roadmap for the rest of the course to reach that result. It's much easier to know that you're driving to Boston and figure out how to get there than it is to simply get on the road and meander through and hope that you end up in some place, maybe Boston. So that's really what we're doing here. When we think about what our students need to know or be able to do at the end of the course, what we're actually identifying is what's going to be significant for them. What is it that they're going to have as a result of our course that might be considered significant learning? And for instance, in my class, whether a student drafts a rule as one sentence or a paragraph is probably not as significant as whether they can solve problems or use some of the skills that they've learned in combination to create some sort of communication that affects a client. So what we're looking for is those deep skills like critical thinking, using knowledge from the course creatively, solving problems, changing the way students actually think about themselves and their others and their relationship with this profession that they're entering, and developing lifelong skills. So this chart, using a chart something like this, where you can have in front of you the pieces to consider as you're developing goals, actually can be very helpful. When I think about designing a course, I will print something like this off and put it on my bulletin board, or I have almost like flashcards with some of these types of things on, and I literally lay them out on the desk so that I don't forget a piece. Because in order to make this significant for the students, designing objectives that address more than just the content will allow the students to take the information that they're getting in your course and actually use it once they leave. As you develop these goals and begin thinking about implementing learning activities to reach the goals, it's also important to remember three things. And this sort of helps us step back from the objectives and say, how do we meet these objectives? We have to remember that we can't learn for the students. They're the ones that actually have to do the learning. That may guide decisions about how we present the information. It's important to remember that simply exposing a student to some sort of content doesn't guarantee that they're going to learn it. And I think we all know that students learn best when they're really fully engaged with the material. So again, as you're setting your objectives, think about how you can help students do more than be exposed and actually engage with that material. And in doing so, if you think about the difference between lower order thinking skills and higher order thinking skills, and focus on those higher order thinking skills, you'll probably find that you're also addressing skills that involve lower order thinking. So for instance, if you're asking someone to evaluate or analyze or design, in order to do so, they're probably going to have to recognize or identify or explain something. So the more we can focus on developing student learning outcomes or objectives that use higher order thinking skills, the more we're also tackling those lower order thinking skills. So we've talked about the context and constraints. We've identified that what we have control of is identifying those learning goals or learning objectives or outcomes for our students. We also have control over how we provide students with feedback and assess that, and how we can provide them with opportunities to provide their own assessment. Now, I could spend all day talking about assessment and assessment strategies, but today my focus really is the learning goals and or the learning objectives or the student learning outcomes, whatever phrase you're using. So I'm going to sort of glance right over this feedback and assessment and move on and talk about how those learning goals help us determine the teaching and learning activities. Because this is where I think it's very possible to have the learning objectives or outcomes really help us become more effective teachers. One of the things to think about when you're trying to identify learning activities that will help you reach those outcomes or help your students reach those outcomes is how engaging is this? How active is the learning? And some of you may have seen this quote before in other places. If you ask yourself as you're walking into class, if there were no students in this classroom, could I do what I'm planning to do? And if you find that the answer is yes, then this isn't active learning. So we want to make sure that we're engaging the students so that they can demonstrate and incorporate what you're doing in the class to meet the outcomes. One way to think about putting all of that together is to literally build yourself a chart. I teach my students to use charts. I find them useful even when I'm designing courses as well. And this is just an example of one type of chart. And the more I play with this, the more I think maybe I would switch the two right-hand categories, but somehow the chart needs to have categories for the actual learning goals or the student learning outcomes, how you're going to eventually assess those, and that's the part that I've sort of skipped over talking about today, and what the learning activities are that will help the students build to the point where you can assess them and they can actually demonstrate those skills. So this just provides an example of one learning goal. I might have as either a sub-goal of an object or a student learning outcome, or as the actual outcome for a course that students can synthesize and analyze primary authorities and formulate a rule. And I'm going to know that they can do that when they provide an office memo at the end of the semester that deals with 5 cases and a statute. And then I'm going to have learning activities that allow me to show the students actually taking the steps to get along the way. And they're also going to be able to see that they are making progress. So this chart allows us to do this for each one of our outcomes or goals for the course. And by doing that, we end up with a list of potential learning activities. Now, sometimes you might not use them all, but if you can identify what learning activities relate to the specific outcomes or goals, it gives you a bigger toolbox of things to fill in through the course. And then we end up with maybe several of these topics for different outcomes. Trying to structure how they all fit together in a logical fashion is the next step. That's a process that means looking at what skills are introduced and then how we build on those skills and then how we eventually assess those skills. But the progression needs to be something that we consider as well, because we're progressing from the beginning to the outcome. Again, the outcome is driving the way we're designing each individual unit, or now each individual course. Each individual class. The goal, as you pull all this information together, is to create an instructional strategy that actually propels the student toward that learning goal. So with the big pieces, the goals or the objectives or the outcomes, the assessment methods, the learning activities, and the overall structure of how they fit together all developed, the final step, almost final step, sorry, is to flesh out the details of the daily and the weekly instructional strategy. Now, this is just one option for doing this. I actually found several charts that look similar to this. Sometimes they look a little funky, but essentially the same thing. You have what goes on in class, what goes on between the class and the next one, and then how you use that material that went on between the classes in the next class. So this may be actually helpful in the pulling together those learning activities that you identified in the earlier chart and putting them into an actual class plan. Notice I'm not saying syllabus yet. This isn't what I'm giving to my students. This is what I use so that I can see what I'm doing in each class, what I'm assigning for the students to do, what practice I'm giving them, and how they're going to make transitions from one class to the next, from homework assignment to the class. And it really gives me a picture that once I discovered doing this, the whole transition from one day to the next seemed to make much more sense. And then finally, I'm not going to go into details about this here, but finally we have to decide how to grade and describe all of that in the syllabus. And though it sometimes feels like it's a daunting amount of work to take all of these steps and to flesh out all these charts, if you do it thoughtfully and thoroughly when you have the time, it actually makes the course itself run more efficiently and more effectively, and it gives you the structure, the skeleton, the outline that allows you to make adjustments as the course continues or as you go back and think about how you do it differently next time. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today, about how that first step of establishing the learning outcomes can guide the entire rest of the process of developing a course and helping us become more effective at communicating that to our students. And I thank you for your attention. And later, once we've heard from Sophie, we'll be glad to answer any questions. I also have my email on the first slide, and that will be available. If you have questions, please feel free to email me.
Thank you.
So I'm going to turn this back over to Kirsten.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. A number of you have emailed me about the availability of Professor Anderson's PowerPoint slides, and we're going to work on making those available for you. And I even see a thank you, Linda, popping up in my question screen. So thank you, all of you out there. Although I can't hear or see you, thank you so much. We are now going to move to Sophie Sparrow, who has been patiently waiting on the line to talk with us now about assessments in the context of the legal writing course. And hopefully, Sophie, you have the screen there available to you. Yes, I see it popping up. Sophie?
Yes.
Okay, great. Got you on board.
Okay.
And I see your screen, so we're good to go.
Great. Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you, Linda, for doing such a great overview. So I'm going to kind of take it to the next step and also talk about how this actually applies in terms of setting the learning goals and then what actually happens when you do this. So, and then once you sort of identify the learning goals and you start measuring them, how you use the information you get from that to then go around and continue your teaching. This is part of what a lot of people commonly often refer to as sort of the assessment cycle, which is that this is a part Linda talked about. There are learning objectives, and then in here is designing the course to meet the learning objectives, figure out how you were going to assess them, and then gather information. Basically, how are you going to measure whether they're meeting your goals? And then you get information about this. Yes, they all know how to synthesize, or some of them are synthesizing better than others. They know how to cite. They know how to make analogies and distinctions, etc. Looking at the information, interpreting the data to look for common themes, and then turning around and then using that to say, okay, I now need to go back and redesign my course. There's a ton of resources on this. If you Google higher ed assessment, there's tons of stuff, and many of the best websites and materials that I've seen are at university teaching and learning centers. You may have one in your own university, and these people are a gold mine. They just know all about teaching and assessment and all sorts of other stuff. And then, shameless promotion, but the book that Kirsten referred to, just Chapter 7 is all about assessment and has a lot of steps in it. So if that's a useful resource, feel free to go there. I want to show you what we did, just for a second here. No, it's not coming up. Second. Sorry. Nope. What we did in our legal writing course is we went through and we identified what students had to do. And so in terms of crafting objectives, many people say you have to provide the context first. So that's this part here. By the end of the first semester, when presented with a set of facts, students will X. And what we wanted to do is we kind of chart it out, as you can see here. And we give this to the students. We want them to be able to fulfill all of these competencies. You'll notice that some of these, like avoid slang, well, this is actually a competencies, an earlier version of competencies, and we were seeing a lot of slang. Once we put it in there, we didn't see it at all. So just by naming it, we got rid of it. So now we've taken that off because it doesn't seem to be a basic problem for students. We then went from there to sort of designing this chart, which is to say that to successfully pass the course in our legal writing course, this was last year, you must meet or exceed competent levels of analysis, writing, and citation in at least one of the last two assignments, case file 3 or case file 4. Basically, we give students case files. The first 3 were closed universe, the last one was open. And they need to get competent in everything. And what we did is we had these criteria. The first memo, as you can see, wasn't worth very much. And they got increasingly more complex. So if they could demonstrate competency in analysis or writing or citation in case file 3, and then they didn't hit competency in all of them they were developing in case file 4, they had proved it sufficiently in case file 3 that we'd say, okay, you're competent to pass the course. The way this translates into grading, so let me just go back here a second. We had our competencies. This is what we expected people to do. These are going to look very similar to what Linda said, but I want you to just pay attention to this one for a second, hierarchy of authority. We took these, we had the chart, and then we developed what we called our standard rubric. So what we did is we said, this is, our categories were exemplary, advanced work for a first-year law student. The work would need very little revision on a job. Proficient work, this is the competent, and then developing on a job, the supervising attorney would need to start over. And that was a helpful way for us to think about it, because often, as we all know, and probably a lot of us are in the middle of grading, is you get something in and you think, boy, they worked so hard on it. But if the bottom line in practice, it would not be helpful. We've got to let students know that. That's our feeling. Anyway, so we had these rubrics designed, and what we do, the way we weight these is if you, let me just show you, I was talking about hierarchy of authority, so here. If students were in this column, which is the exemplary column, they get 2 points for each of these 14 criteria. If they're incompetent, they get 1 point, and if they're in developing, they get 0. So we identified this. Going back, when we applied it to case file 3 and case file 4, we noticed two things. Year 1 in which we did this, we noticed that students were not doing weight of authority mostly accurately. And this was in the context of a MPT type exam, which students had all day to complete on a Saturday, the last week of classes. And we were shocked that given a limited case file with 3 authorities, 3 cases, and a statute, students did not understand which was the most important case and how certain cases from higher courts trumped other cases. Very disturbing to find this out in December. So that was very disturbing. The second year, what we found is we have a separate citation rubric, and just to remind you on the chart, you had to get competent citation for case file 3 and case file 3 or case file 4. And there were a number of students who didn't reach that. They didn't do competent citation as we had identified what it was, and we don't have a perfection standard for competence. Competence and even exemplary can include minor formatting errors because we feel that's realistic with practice. But they weren't even reaching competency. Well, how does this play out? So we've identified our learning outcomes. We've now been measuring them, but we said to pass the course, you must meet or exceed competent levels of analysis. So here we were faced with a situation where we thought we had taught citations so that everybody could be competent for case file 3 or case file 4, and they weren't. So what do? We had told them they wouldn't pass the course, but we didn't know whether this was because we had done improper instruction. We had failed to give them enough coaching and active learning things, as Linda referred to enable them to pass and become confident. Had we given them enough clear feedback? They'd had lots of feedback, rubrics, comments, margin notes, all of the above, teaching assistance sessions, Cali, you name it. They had lots of opportunities, but they weren't there, and a lot of students were freaking out. What we'd ended up doing is, and this is a be careful what you tell your students you're going to enforce, because we had to go and say, we're not going to do this. We are not going to implement this part of our requirements to successfully pass the course. And instead what we did is there were a number of people who turned in, pretty much everybody was competent in writing and analysis. Well, everybody was competent in writing and analysis. But the not reaching competence was only in citation. And what we told those students is, we've graded your memos, and they've not earned very many points, unfortunately, but you can now, or you need to if you want to get credit for this course, you can revise your memo and correct the mistakes and turn in a revised one. And if that demonstrates competency, then you can go on to the second semester. And people did that, and that seemed fair because the goal was not to punish them or to require them to take the course over, but to see if they could reach competency. They still got the original grade, but they were able to go on. So those are examples of, I'm going to just move screens here again. Sorry. So that is the difference between our view of sort of the fantasy and the reality, which is you think by naming all of these things it's going to be fine and you're going to get what you want, and the reality was somewhat different. As somebody who's been working with learning outcomes and assessment tools and active learning for over 10 years, I do want to stress that this stuff, it looks simple and easy, but as one person said, teaching is really easy until you walk in the classroom. And teaching is a science until you walk into the classroom. So one plug I would make here for anybody who wants to be working on outcomes assessment is that you start small and you keep tweaking as you go, because every year we have modified, adjusted, and tweaked our competencies and our rubrics to reflect what's realistic in light of our students, what's realistic in light of our assignments, what's realistic in terms of what we can do, what we think is reasonable, and how to refine our measurements. And I will stop here and turn it back over to Kirsten. Thanks, Kirsten, and I welcome everyone's questions.
Okay, great. Just give me 1 second to change over to my screen here. And we've been getting some questions coming in the question box. So that's great. Thank you all. And if you have more questions, please make sure that you go ahead and give those to us. I'm seeing a question here, Sophie, I think this is addressed to you, and Linda, you as well, that says, do you ever find that having a rubric as detailed as your examples causes more frustration among the students? Can you elaborate on some of the dangers of giving students a very detailed rubric?
Sure, I can do that.
Okay, great.
Our rubrics actually, and this is one of the major changes we've made over the years, they used to be really, really elaborate. Sometimes they were practically as long as the memos, and that was a little cumbersome. If you look at the rubric, now they are 2 pages. It's pretty detailed, but it doesn't, when you actually get down to it, there's plenty of holes there, which is not to say that we want the holes, but I don't think it's as detailed as actually it could be. And usually what happens is that the first time students complete an assignment, many of them don't even look at the rubrics. We tell them, this is the criteria on which you will be graded. Many of them have had these in high school or college, and so they nod their heads when we say, do you know what this is? But they don't really read it, or if they read it, they don't study it. And then when they get them back, and and the little different boxes are checked, and sometimes we have circles and arrows, and you're in this box for this category, but you're pretty close to the next jump over. Then they start to pay attention to it. And most students will look at the rubric, and after the first assignment, when they get it back, they actually find it helpful. And I find it helpful because they'll come into office hours and they'll say, I don't understand why this is developing. And I can sit with them and we pull it up on the screen and we look at their rubric, and I'll look at the rubric and we'll look at their paper and I'll say, okay, show me one of the categories, for example, is case comparisons. And do you show how the cases are similar or different? And then do you explain why those similarities matter? And the student might have gotten showing what the similarities are, but not the reasoning piece, why they matter. And I'll say, show me in the paper where this is given. And they'll read their paper. And then usually the light bulb comes on and they go, wow, that was in my head. And I'll say, well, what were you thinking? And they rattle off this brilliant explanation of how these cases are significant and why this matters and everything. And then I'll ask them, show me where that is on the page. And it's not. And usually for many people, that's an eye-opener. And so I actually haven't found them to be frustrated with it. Instead, what they get frustrated is they wish that we could be more detailed about them. And then in courses where I haven't prepared a rubric in advance in some of my upper-level electives, they want to know where it is. I'll stop there.
And let me just add, too, that I've worked with rubrics that are very, very detailed. And there's always something that we could have added to the rubric, and some student is going to say, well, but I did this. Usually what we've been able to do is identify enough places in the other aspects of the rubric where that whatever this is that they just are pointing out as something that they should have gotten credit in one aspect of the rubric, I can usually find a place where they did get credit for doing it in a different area, but I happened to choose not to look at it for that particular aspect of the rubric. So it does take a little bit more explanation with the students, but it forces them to walk into your office and have that conversation. And I think that's a reason for doing it, even though sometimes the detail can cause them a little bit of confusion, because that conversation that you have with them can be much more effective than them just sitting and saying, well, next time I've got to do something different.
Great. Thank you. We've seen some questions, Linda, on the issue of learning activities. For example, one of our listeners writes in, I agree with the importance of designing learning activities, but with only 2 or 3 at best credit hours, how do we manage it all? Or should I be thinking about student learning activities that take place outside my classroom?
I think when we're talking about learning activities, again, we're talking about things both inside and outside the classroom, because as you sit down and think about what your objectives are, what the outcome is that you're trying to help the student demonstrate, sometimes it takes several steps to get to that point, and they're going to understand it more effectively and be able to demonstrate it more competently if they actually get the chance to do it. So some of those activities may take place between the classes, and I think that's why I found that last chart so helpful, and sort of like the light bulb went on when I saw that it's not just reading assignments that I should be thinking about between classes, but is there something that I want them to do so that we can go farther in the actual short period of time that I have them in the classroom in front of me. So when I talk about learning activities, I'm not necessarily just talking about in-classroom learning activities. I'm talking about what is going to happen to help them develop the skills.
Yeah, and if I could jump in here, I do the same thing. I think about, like today, they had just read a series of cases. That's the beginning of their second memo, and in order to have the class be productive, they had to have read all the cases, and they had to figure out of a multi-issue memo which of the 7 cases addressed which issues. And then in class, what they did is they were working in groups, and they had to identify which were the 2 or 3 best authorities for each issue and why. And so we got into this hierarchy of authority, because now I'm teaching that like a dead horse. But what I often require is that students, there's an expectation, and we carry through with it, where students, if they're not prepared for some classes, they're not allowed to participate. Because the biggest reasons that I've heard from students over the year is that they love working with other people and doing a lot of active learning as long as everybody's prepared. And if people aren't prepared, then there's free rider problems and all sorts of other things. So I agree with Linda. Heavy emphasis on what they do out of class, but I also, and the literature I've read on this suggests that the best thing we can do for our students is to allow them to work individually outside of class and not require them to work with other people outside of class, because it's really hard with their schedules for them to get together outside of class. But if everybody comes prepared, then you start at a pretty high level, and you don't have to sort of do all this warm-up and catch people up. The other thing is that what I found is that going to that mode of, like, you're required to be prepared for class, or you might not be able to stay there and participate, is that they are prepared for class, 1, and 2, they find that they get more out of it if they meet outside of class, but they're choosing to do it on their own as a study group, not by me telling them.
And let me just clarify that when I say learning activities, many times, just as Sophie was saying, many times that's individual work when it's outside of class. It's still an activity. It doesn't mean that they're interacting with other people all the time, though.
We have a question about the Carnegie Report and the CLIA Best Practices Manual. And this question says, those sources encourage teaching more and more practical skills, interviewing, counseling, negotiation, for example. It seems hard to determine how to integrate some of those lawyering skills without being superficial and without sacrificing some of the basic goals of legal writing as outlined in your chart, Sophie. And so the listener is asking, should we be trying to do that, integrate those more practical skills such as interviewing, counseling, and negotiation?
Wow, that's a that's a great question, and my bottom line is that I think that everything should be integrated everywhere. I actually don't think that there should be separate skills classes. I think that there can be skills classes, but I think that every doctrinal course should be integrating some skills and writing. I think that you should have professionalism and skills and writing across the curriculum, and one of the things that a number of schools have started to do, and Australia and England are way ahead of us, the UK are way ahead of us, but curriculum mapping, where if you're doing it superficially in a first-year legal writing course, then it behooves people in the second and third year courses to then build on it and develop more sophisticated interviewing or interviewing witnesses or conducting depositions or interviewing hostile clients or providing more counseling, not just conducting the initial one, or follow-up interviews, all of those kinds of things. And I think there is superficial. But I think that the bigger question is looking at the big picture, which we've just started to do. Our curriculum committee has been working on this for a year, is mapping out where is a skill introduced, where is it practiced, and where is it demonstrated. And it may be introduced and practiced in many different places, but it might not be demonstrated until somebody's third year.
I'm not sure I want to add anything to that. So.
Okay, so I was waiting, Linda, sort of. I think you got an amen, Sophie, to that. I think that had to do with how much more can you get in the first semester curriculum. So there was someone that typed in amen to that. We have a question here about grading, which of course comes up that given that a lot of our programs grade projects all throughout the semester, and this listener is asking, is it better to grade or not grade writing projects that are really learning activities, I guess with respect to that assessment during the semester? So is it better to grade or not grade those?
I want to tackle that one just for a second because I've tried both ways. And I think the decision has to be whether you are comfortable grading a student's learning curve or whether you're more interested in whether they're demonstrating that they've met the goal or the outcome by the end of the course. And though you might end up finding that you need to grade in order to encourage students to do their best, if you can do the early grades with much less emphasis, meaning a smaller percentage of their overall grade, I think that may be sort of the carrot that gets them to do their best on each assignment if you find that necessary. But you have to recognize that by doing so you are grading their learning curve. And they all learn at different speeds. Someone's going to have this click on at the very beginning and then take the benefit of that in the grade, and others won't have it click until that very last assignment. So I don't know that I have the answer, but I think I know I'm always trying to figure out which of those considerations I think is important or not. At the moment I lean much more heavily toward not grading early on so that they have the opportunity to get significant feedback, the same type of feedback I would do as if I was grading, but the opportunity to learn from their mistakes without it hurting them.
Yeah, and I think this is really hard, and you know, this is one of those. If I was czarina of legal education, I would say all courses would be pass-fail, but we would have minimum competencies that everybody would have to meet in order to pass. So it would be rigorous, but you wouldn't have to have these distinctions. I think, I mean, the people who are the real experts in assessment say that nothing should ride on one assignment alone. So the idea of the 100% on the final memo is probably not a good idea. And the better idea is to have multiple means of assessment and multiple numbers of assessments and a variety of assessments. That being said, I think Linda's point is exactly right, which is where do you put the grades? And whatever you do, I like to have grades, you know, at least some grades for
We've lost Sophie. I apologize, and I had myself muted, folks. While we wait on her to call back in, I'm going to ask Linda if she had anything else to add on that question of assessment, or I'm sorry, on the question of grading.
The grading. I think Sophie's point about not having everything ride on one final grade is an important one, and that's something that was discussed a great deal at this conference over the weekend was there are lots of ways to assess and spread out the opportunity to demonstrate mastery or demonstrate competence throughout the period of the course. So I do agree with her about not having it all be that 100% end of the semester grade.
Great. One question that came up is how programs can use these outcomes, Linda, outcomes building as a program. When you were talking, it sounds very much like it might be a professor-to-professor approach with thinking about outcomes, and this question asks, how do you use outcomes with respect to program design?
Well, I think it's the same type of process, but instead of saying, what do I want my students to be able to do by the time they finish my course, you actually just have to step back and say, all right, our program is 2 or 3 courses. What is it that we want our students to do when they finish all of the courses or when they get through the entire writing program? And the goal, the objectives or the outcomes become more sophisticated, certainly, and probably more general, because rather than having the first semester course focus just on objective writing, the program goal might be that they can effectively communicate their analysis about a legal issue or something even more broad than that. But then we go through the same steps again. We identify the activities that are involved, and you can identify where those are within the program, and there may be multiple places, and how you're going to assess it, and how you're going to communicate the all of that to the students. So I think the process just gets a little larger and a little more generalized when you hit the program level. And then actually many of us who are working on regional accreditation issues are also going even further and saying, how do we look at this from the entire curriculum of the law school, the program, the institutional assessment. Once again, the questions just get bigger. It's not what do you want them to be able to do when they finish the program, but what do you want them to be able to do when they graduate from the law school. Same process, just bigger questions.
Great. Sophie, I think you're back with us, right?
I am.
Great, great. There was a question that came in specifically for you. How do you connect assessment techniques that you're describing on year-to-year program assessment? So I'm guessing that means, how do you look at all of these outcomes of your students and ask the bigger questions about how to design or redesign the writing program as a whole?
Well, we do very much what Linda talks about. We start with the end. So when we designed our competencies a couple of years ago, what we did is we said, okay, this is what we think people should learn. We identified how we thought they would get there. And then we worked backwards and said, what are the, how are they going to show these learning outcomes? And we said, okay, well, they're going to have, a complex open universe memo where they have to figure out factual inferences and derive facts from a number of different places in different documents, or similarly client interviews. They have to find and select the authorities. They have to organize, et cetera, et cetera. And then we backed up from there and say, if that's their sort of capstone demonstration, if you will, that they've met that learning outcome, what do we have to do to get them there? Well, they've got to practice doing a multi-issue memo before that, probably in a more limited universe, so they can actually cut their teeth on this, get practice, get feedback. For us, they do drafts. So we don't grade the draft, but we will grade the final. And then we back up and say, well, we wanted to have them do this more than twice, because twice isn't likely to be enough practice for them. And so let's introduce it with a shorter, closed memo, much more simple, one issue, so that they can wrap their heads around it. And it's part of the cycle in the sense that you're constantly going back and saying, what have they learned? What haven't they learned? What do I need to do differently this time? And also, I think that as legal writing teachers, we also have to be really aware of what's sustainable. So last year, we had 4 memos. And this year, in April and May, when we were planning this current fall, we said, we're cutting back to 3. because we were all a wreck by the end of that. So we'll go back to 3, but let's talk about how we can do it differently, and let's see if we can get better quality by thinking about and planning the things that Linda's talking about, which is planning what they're doing in class, what they're producing at the end of, say, a unit, and what they're doing in between class to help get them ready for that. So we have actually gone to a model where for different, we've kind of broken it down into modules, and they have quizzes that they take. They're open Blue Book quizzes, but they have to take quizzes, which gets them to do the reading and think about how to evaluate the answers to different questions about, like we'll show them 4 different short paragraphs of writing samples and say which one demonstrates the best synthesis, which one demonstrates the best analogies, which one demonstrates the best citation, so that they learn how to recognize and practice and prepare for those things in preparation for being able to then take it to the higher level of the learning skills that Linda was talking about, of being able to then create it and do it on their own.
Well, I think we're coming pretty close to the end of our time together, and so I want to thank both of our panelists for joining us, Sophie Sparrow and Linda Anderson. Thank you for what was a really informative time, and thank you for all of you who asked questions. I apologize that we couldn't get to them all, and for those of you who asked about are these going to be available, the rubrics and the information, we're working right now on a website that's going to allow us to have replay of this webinar for folks and to give you access to some of those resources. So we'll be letting you know when that comes available. We also will be having another one on October the 7th on moot court coaching strategies. And when you sign off today, you're going to see a couple questions from us for feedback. One is what you thought about today, if you have anything you want to give us in terms of advice or suggestions or whatever's on your mind, and then if you have thoughts about what you'd like to hear about in the future on these webinars. So again, thank you all. Again, thanks to our panelists, and hope everyone out there has a great day. Thank you.